calming journey into the desert's greatest mystery. Settle in now. Let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift toward the vast, quiet desert of Nevada. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most enduring mysteries of our time, not with urgency or alarm, but with the gentle curiosity of someone gazing at stars on a clear night. Let the tension leave your shoulders, feel the weight of your body sinking into comfort, and prepare to hear a story that has captivated millions for over 3 decades. This is a tale of alleged alien technology, government secrecy, and one man's controversial claims that changed how the world thinks about Area 51. Whether you believe it or not, doesn't matter right now. What matters is that you're here, relaxed, ready to let these words wash over you like a warm desert breeze. So close your eyes if you wish, breathe deeply, and let's begin our journey into the hidden truths that Bob Lazar brought to the world in 1980. The Nevada desert at twilight. Imagine, if you will, standing on the edge of the Nevada desert as the sun begins its slow descent beyond the distant mountains. The sky transforms from brilliant blue to shades of amber, rose, and finally deep purple, painting the landscape in colors that seem almost otherworldly. The air, which has been scorching all day, begins to cool, bringing with it that distinctive desert smell of dust and sage that speaks of ancient times and untold secrets. This is the Mojave Desert, a place of extremes where daytime temperatures can soar above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, yet nights can plunge towards freezing. It's a landscape that seems almost alien itself, with its twisted Joshua trees reaching toward the sky like supplicants praying to unseen gods, its rust-colored rocks that have weathered millions of years of sun and wind, and its vast salt flats that shimmer like mirrors under the moonlight. Approximately 90 miles northwest of the glittering lights of Las Vegas lies a place that officially didn't exist for decades. You won't find it marked clearly on most civilian maps. The locals have given it many names over the years. Some call it Groom Lake, after the dry lake bed that serves as one of the longest runways in the world. Others refer to it as Homey Airport, or the more evocative Dreamland. The government simply calls it a detachment of Edwards Air Force Base. But to the world, it is known by a more mysterious designation: Area 51. The facility sits in a basin surrounded by mountains, a natural fortress that provides both concealment and security. The ancient lakebed of Groom Lake, a flat expanse of cracked earth stretching for miles, provides the perfect surface for testing aircraft that push the boundaries of what humans thought possible. From above, the base appears as a collection of buildings, hangars, and runways carved into the desert floor. A human settlement in one of the most remote and inhospitable regions of the American Southwest. But the isolation is not accidental. This remoteness is precisely why the Central Intelligence Agency and the United States Air Force chose this location in 1955 as a testing ground for the U-2 spy plane, an aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet, higher than any plane before it, beyond the reach of enemy interceptors and surface-to-air missiles. The very altitude at which the U-2 flew would, ironically, later fuel countless reports of unidentified flying objects by people who had never seen an aircraft fly so high, its silver body catching the sun's rays long after twilight had fallen on the ground below. As darkness settles completely over the desert, the stars emerge in their full glory. Without the light pollution of cities, the Milky Way stretches across the sky like a river of light, so dense with stars that it seems almost solid. On a clear night, you can see satellites drifting slowly across the heavens, their steady movement distinguishing them from the fixed stars. Sometimes, if you're lucky and know when to look, you might catch the brief brilliant streak of a meteor burning up in Earth's atmosphere. It's under skies like these that the legends of Area 51 have flourished. The very isolation that makes it perfect for secret aircraft testing also makes it perfect for speculation, for wondering what might be hidden behind those distant mountains, inside those carefully camouflaged hangars, beneath the desert floor itself. The security around the base is legendary and absolute. The perimeter is marked with orange posts and signs warning that photography is prohibited, that trespassing is forbidden, that deadly force is authorized against intruders. Motion sensors buried in the desert floor detect any approach. Cameras mounted on nearby peaks watch every angle. Security personnel in white Jeep Cherokees, nicknamed Camo Dudes by the UFO watchers, patrol the borders with military precision. Above, surveillance aircraft circle, their sensors probing for any unauthorized presence. The message is clear. Whatever happens inside Area 51 is none of your business, and the government prefers to keep it that way. Yet despite all this secrecy, or perhaps because of it, Area 51 has become the most famous military base in the world. It has appeared in countless movies, television shows, books, and video games. It has become synonymous with government cover-ups, with hidden technology, and most especially with the possibility that we are not alone in the universe, that somewhere in those hangars, or in underground facilities carved into the mountains, the US government possesses proof of extraterrestrial life. The town of Rachel, Nevada, population approximately 50 people, sits about 25 miles north of the base along State Highway 375, a lonely stretch of road that the state officially designated as the extraterrestrial highway in 1996. The Little Alien, a small restaurant and inn, serves as the unofficial gathering place for UFO enthusiasts, curious tourists, and anyone drawn to the mystery of what lies beyond those guarded borders. Its walls are covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and testimonials from people who claim to have seen strange lights in the night sky, objects that moved in ways no conventional aircraft could match. Some of these sightings have mundane explanations. The Air Force has tested numerous cutting-edge aircraft at Area 51 over the decades. After the U-2 came the SR-71 Blackbird, a reconnaissance plane that could fly at Mach 3.2 and cruise at 85,000 feet. The F-117 Nighthawk, the first operational stealth fighter, was developed and tested here, its angular faceted design looking unlike any aircraft that had come before. The mere sight of such revolutionary aircraft, glimpsed briefly in the desert twilight, would certainly seem otherworldly to anyone unfamiliar with their existence. But some sightings, according to witnesses, defy conventional explanation. Lights that hover motionless for minutes before accelerating instantly to impossible speeds. Objects that make right-angle turns without slowing down. Craft that emit no sound, no exhaust, no visible means of propulsion. These reports, consistent over decades and coming from credible witnesses, including military personnel, have kept the speculation alive that something more than advanced human technology is being studied in the Nevada desert. And it was into this landscape of secrets and speculation that a man named Robert Scott Lazar emerged in 1989 with claims that would electrify the world and thrust Area 51 permanently into the public consciousness. His story would be immediately controversial, simultaneously embraced and ridiculed, believed in the social consciousness, but whatever the truth of his claims, there's no denying that Bob Lazar changed the conversation about Area 51 forever, transforming it from a secret military base to the epicenter of UFO lore worldwide. Bob Lazar, the enigmatic whistleblower. To understand the claims that Bob Lazar would make, we first need to understand the man himself, though that task proves more difficult than you might expect. Bob Lazar is, in many ways, as much a mystery as the secrets he claims to have witnessed. Born Robert Scott Lazar, he grew up with an apparent fascination for science and technology, particularly anything that moved fast. Friends and acquaintances describe him as intelligent, curious, and drawn to unconventional projects. He built jet-powered cars, tinkered with particle accelerators, and pursued interests that most people would consider the domain of science fiction. He had, by all accounts, the kind of mind that looked at a problem and immediately started thinking about radical solutions rather than conventional ones. His educational background, however, is one of the most contentious aspects of his story. Lazar claims to have earned master's degrees in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and in electronics from the California Institute of Technology, two of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. These credentials, if true, would certainly qualify him for work on advanced government projects. However, both MIT and Caltech have stated unequivocally that they have no records of Lazar ever attending their institutions, let alone graduating from them. Lazar's explanation for these missing records is that the government deliberately erased all evidence of his education as part of an effort to discredit him after he went public with his claims. His critics point out that this is convenient, unfalsifiable, and remarkably similar to the classic conspiracy theory trope of the all-powerful government that can erase someone's entire history. They also note that Lazar has been unable to provide the names of any professors he studied under, any fellow students he knew, or any other details that might corroborate his claimed time at these institutions. What can be verified is that Lazar did have some connection to Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico during the early 1980s. A 1982 phone directory from Los Alamos lists a Robert Lazar, and a local newspaper article from that same year profiles him and his interest in jet-powered cars, describing him as a physicist at the Los Alamos Mason Physics Facility. This article has been used by Lazar supporters as evidence that he did work in a scientific capacity at a government facility. However, investigations into his role at Los Alamos suggest a more modest position than he has claimed. According to multiple sources, Lazar worked as a technician for a contractor firm rather than as a physicist employed directly by the laboratory. This is an important distinction. Technicians perform valuable work, but they typically don't have the advanced degrees or the level of access that senior scientists possess. Los Alamos officials have stated they have no records of Lazar working as a physicist for the facility itself, which is consistent with him having been a contractor rather than a direct employee. His financial history also raises questions. In 1986, Lazar filed for bankruptcy, describing himself as a self-employed film processor. This seems an odd profession for someone claiming to hold advanced degrees in physics and electronics from MIT and Caltech. Critics argue that this bankruptcy filing, a legal document that Lazar himself completed, provides a more accurate picture of his actual qualifications than his later claims about prestigious degrees. Yet those who know Lazar personally paint a picture of someone genuinely knowledgeable about science and technology. He has demonstrated practical expertise in areas like chemistry and physics. After his time in the spotlight, he founded United Nuclear Scientific Equipment and Supplies, a company that sells scientific equipment, chemicals, and materials to researchers, educators, and hobbyists. The company has faced legal issues, including violations related to the sale of restricted chemicals, but it does require real scientific knowledge to operate. Lazar's personality, as described by friends and associates, is marked by a certain defiance of convention. He's not someone who seems to crave mainstream acceptance or validation. He flies a Jolly Roger flag over his house. He has interests that many would consider eccentric. He's built jet engines, worked with particle accelerators on a hobbyist level, and pursued projects that blur the line between serious science and pure enthusiasm. This is not the profile of a typical government scientist working on classified projects, which is precisely what makes some people skeptical that he would have been recruited for such work. On the other hand, this unconventional nature is exactly what makes other people wonder if maybe, just maybe, he's telling the truth. If you were going to make up a story about working on alien spacecraft, would you choose to be someone with such a checkered and easily challengeable background? Would you make claims that could so easily be investigated and picked apart? Or would you give yourself an unassailable background, impeccable credentials, and a sterling reputation? Lazar himself seems remarkably unconcerned with whether people believe him. In interviews over the decades, he often seems reluctant to discuss his claims, as if he'd rather move on with his life, but keeps getting pulled back into the story. He said multiple times that he wishes he'd never come forward, that the attention has been more of a burden than a benefit, and that he has no interest in fame or in being the center of the UFO community's attention. This reluctance is interesting because it doesn't fit the typical pattern of hoaxers or attention seekers, who usually lean into their claims, elaborating on them, adding details, seeking speaking engagements and interviews. Lazar, by contrast, often has to be coaxed into discussing Area 51 and his alleged experiences there. He runs his business, pursues his scientific interests, and seems to view his brief moment in the UFO spotlight as something that happened a long time ago to a different person. His personal life has had its complications. In 1990, just a year after going public with his claims about Area 51, Lazar was arrested and charged in connection with his involvement in an illegal prostitution operation. He pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of felony pandering and was sentenced to community service and probation. This conviction has been used by skeptics as further evidence of poor judgment and questionable character. Supporters, however, note that this arrest and conviction had nothing to do with the truthfulness of his claims about working on alien technology, and that many people with legal troubles in their past are told the truth about other matters. Later, in 2006, he and his wife were charged with violating federal hazardous substances laws for shipping restricted chemicals across state lines through his company United Nuclear. The company pleaded guilty and was fined. Again, critics point to this as evidence of someone who doesn't respect rules and regulations. Someone whose word perhaps shouldn't be trusted. Supporters counter that running a scientific supply company involves navigating complex regulations, and violations don't necessarily indicate dishonesty about unrelated claims. So who is Bob Lazar? Is he a self-taught scientific enthusiast who exaggerated his credentials and fabricated an elaborate story about alien technology? Is he a government scientist who worked on the most classified program in human history and whose credentials were deliberately erased to discredit him? Is he someone who genuinely believes what he's saying but was himself deceived, perhaps as part of a disinformation campaign? Or is the truth something else entirely, something more complex than a simple true or false binary? What we can say with certainty is that in 1989, this controversial, unconventional, scientifically knowledgeable, but educationally questionable man would make claims that captured the imagination of the world and forever changed how people think about Area 51, secret government programs, and the possibility of extraterrestrial contact. May 1980. The man called Dennis. The spring of 1989 was a time of significant change in the world. The Cold War was beginning to thaw. In China, students were gathering in Tiananmen Square to demand democratic reforms. In Las Vegas, Nevada, however, the most dramatic revelation of that May had nothing to do with geopolitics and everything to do with a story that seemed straight out of science fiction. George Knapp, an investigative reporter for KLS-TV, Las Vegas's CBS affiliate, had built a reputation for serious journalism. He'd won Edward R. Murrow Awards and was known for tackling difficult subjects like government corruption and nuclear safety. He was not, in other words, someone given to sensationalism or tabloid journalism, which made what happened on May 15, 1985-9, all the more remarkable. That evening, during KLS TV's 5 o'clock newscast, Knapp conducted a live interview with a man whose face was hidden in silhouette and who used the pseudonym Dennis. The interview had come together at the last minute. Knapp's scheduled guest had cancelled, and he needed someone to fill the 5-minute interview segment. He'd been in contact with John Lear, a well-known aviator and UFO enthusiast, who had mentioned knowing someone who claimed to have worked on actual flying saucers at a secret facility near Area 51. With little time to prepare and no real verification of the guest's claims, Knapp brought this mysterious Dennis onto the show and let him tell his story. What viewers heard that evening was extraordinary. Dennis claimed that he had worked at a facility called S4, located south of Area 51 proper, near a dry lakebed called Papoose Lake. He said he'd been brought there by Janet Airlines, the unofficial name for the classified commuter flights that ferry workers to Area 51 and its surrounding facilities from Las Vegas. According to Dennis, S4 was unlike anything most people could imagine. It consisted of hangars built into the side of a mountain, disguised to blend in with the natural desert terrain. The camouflage was so effective that you could be looking right at it and not realize there was anything there but rock and sand. These hangars, he said, housed 9 flying disc-shaped craft of extraterrestrial origin. The United States government possessed 9 actual spacecraft from another world, and they were attempting to figure out how they worked through a process of reverse engineering. Dennis claimed he'd been hired specifically to work on the propulsion system of one of these craft, which he called the Sport model. His job was to help understand the exotic physics that allowed these vehicles to fly, physics that seemed to defy everything known about how aircraft and spacecraft operate. The technology, he said, was so advanced that it was like showing a smartphone to someone from the 17th century and asking them to figure out how it worked. The phones at KLS TV went wild. Viewers called in with questions, with their own stories of strange sightings in the Nevada desert, with expressions of belief and skepticism. The station had clearly touched a nerve. The topic of UFOs and government secrets resonated with people in a way that few news stories do. Over the following months, Knapp and his team worked to verify what Dennis had told them. They checked his background, tried to confirm his claimed employment, and sought any evidence that might corroborate or disprove his story. In the process, they discovered several interesting things. They found that phone directory from Los Alamos and the newspaper article that seemed to support the claim that this man had worked at the laboratory. They also found that both the schools he claimed to have attended and the employers he claimed to have worked for, including the defense contractor EG&G that supposedly hired him for the S4 program, all said they had no records of him. Los Alamos officials told Knapp they had no records of Dennis ever working there, despite the phone directory listing and newspaper article that suggested otherwise. By November of 1989, Knapp and KLAS-TV were ready to air a more comprehensive series of reports. This time, Dennis appeared without the silhouette, revealing himself to be Bob Lazar. The series, titled UFOs The Best Evidence, ran on consecutive nights and included not just Lazar's claims but also Knapp's attempts to verify them and the various contradictions he'd uncovered. The broadcasts were a sensation. They became the highest-rated local news programs in Las Vegas history. The story spread rapidly beyond Nevada, picked up by news outlets around the world. Suddenly, Area 51, which had been a poorly kept secret among aviation enthusiasts and local residents, but was largely unknown to the general public, became globally famous as the place where the US government supposedly kept alien spacecraft. Lazar's claims were specific and technical. He described the Sport model as being approximately 52 feet in diameter and 16 feet tall. He said it was constructed of a metal that looked and felt similar to stainless steel, but had properties unlike any terrestrial metal. The craft could apparently be tilted on its side for maintenance, revealing an interior that included a small central reactor, what Lazar called gravity amplifiers, and seats that were clearly designed for beings much smaller than adult humans. He spoke about briefing documents he claimed to have read at S4. Papers that described not just the spacecraft but also the history of alien contact with Earth. These documents, he said, claimed that extraterrestrials had been involved with humanity for thousands of years, subtly guiding our development. He spoke of different species, though he said his knowledge was limited because each person at S4 was only given information directly relevant to their specific task. The propulsion system, he explained, operated on principles completely foreign to conventional aerospace engineering. It didn't use rocket engines or jet engines or anything that created thrust by expelling mass. Instead, it manipulated gravity itself. The craft generated its own gravitational field that it could amplify and direct. By distorting space-time around the vessel, it essentially fell toward wherever it wanted to go. This meant it could accelerate instantly, make 90-degree turns without banking, and achieve speeds that would tear apart any conventional aircraft. The power source for this remarkable propulsion system, Lazar claimed, was an element that didn't exist on Earth, at least not naturally. He called it Element 115. This element, he said, possessed properties that allowed it to amplify gravity waves when properly stimulated. It was this gravity amplification that gave the craft its extraordinary performance capabilities. What made this claim particularly interesting was that in 1989, element 115 didn't exist on the periodic table. The heaviest elements known at that time only went up to about element 109. Lazar was claiming that these alien spacecraft used an element that hadn't even been discovered yet by human science. Skeptics pointed to this as obvious evidence of fabrication. How convenient, they said, to claim the technology relies on something that doesn't exist and therefore can't be examined or tested. However, here's where the story takes an interesting turn. In 2003, a team of Russian and American scientists successfully synthesized element 115 for the first time using a particle accelerator. They bombarded americium atoms with calcium ions, creating a few atoms of the new element. It was added to the periodic table and eventually named moscovium. The element exists for only a fraction of a second before decaying into lighter elements, but it exists. Lazar's supporters point to this as vindication. He talked about element 1 14 years before it was discovered. How could he have known about it if he wasn't telling the truth about working on alien technology? Skeptics counter that physicists had long predicted that such elements should theoretically be possible. Lazar, with his interest in science, could have simply made an educated guess. Moreover, they point out, the moscovium that scientists created is nothing like what Lazar described. It's highly unstable, and certainly couldn't power a spacecraft. Lazar, however, has always maintained that the element at S4 was a stable isotope of element 115, a version with a different number of neutrons that wouldn't decay almost instantly. The debate over element 115 illustrates the larger problem with Lazar's claims. They're detailed enough to sound plausible, but vague enough in crucial areas to be unfalsifiable. The element exists, but not in the form he described. He worked at Los Alamos, but not as he claimed. The science he describes uses real physics concepts, like gravity waves and space-time distortion, but applies them in ways that physicists say are impossible with our current understanding of how the universe works. George Knapp, for his part, has remained somewhat ambiguous about what he believes. In interviews over the years, he said that while he can't verify Lazar's core claims about working on alien technology, he does believe Lazar had some kind of experience at a secure facility in the Nevada desert. Knapp points to the fact that Lazar knew to look for test flights on specific Wednesday nights, and that witnesses who went with him into the desert did see unusual aerial phenomena. He also notes that Lazar's life has been far from easy since going public, which doesn't fit the profile of someone who made up a story for attention or profit. What cannot be disputed is the impact of those 1989 broadcasts. Before Bob Lazar came forward, Area 51 was a secret base that most Americans had never heard of. After his interviews with George Knapp, it became the world's most famous alleged repository of alien secrets, a place that would be referenced in countless movies, TV shows, books, and video games. The Storm Area 51 event in 2019, which started as a joke but attracted worldwide attention, would never have happened without Bob Lazar's claims 30 years earlier. For better or worse, Bob Lazar put Area 51 on the map, not as a testing ground for experimental aircraft, but as the place where, according to him, humanity's greatest secret was hidden. Proof that we are not alone in the universe. S4. The facility in the mountains. If Bob Lazar's claims are true, then somewhere in the Nevada desert south of Area 51 proper, there exists a facility that represents humanity's most closely guarded secret. He called it S4, though whether that designation is official or simply his name for it remains unclear. Let's explore what Lazar described about this mysterious location, examining the details he provided about its location, appearance, and function. According to Lazar, S4 is located near Papoose Lake, another dry lakebed similar to Groom Lake, but smaller and more isolated. Papoose Lake sits roughly 10 to 15 miles south of the main Area 51 facility, at Groom Lake. The terrain in this area is typical Mojave Desert, flat basins surrounded by barren mountains, with very little vegetation save for scattered creosote bushes and the occasional Joshua tree. The mountains themselves are composed of exposed rock in shades of red, brown, and gray, weathered by millions of years of wind and temperature extremes. Lazar described S4 as being built into the side of one of these mountains in a way that would be virtually invisible from any distance. The hangars, he said, were actually inside the mountain itself, carved out of the rock. The doors to these hangars were designed to match the surrounding terrain so perfectly that even from a relatively short distance, you wouldn't realize they were there. The camouflage work was apparently so sophisticated that you could be looking directly at a hangar door and think you were just seeing natural mountain face. The approach to S4, according to Lazar, involved flying into Area 51 on one of the Janet Airlines flights from Las Vegas. These flights are real and well documented. They operate out of a separate terminal at what was then called McCarran International Airport, now Harry Reid International Airport. The aircraft are distinctive, white Boeing 737s with a red stripe running along the side. No airline markings beyond a simple registration number. These planes make daily flights to Groom Lake and back, carrying workers with the necessary security clearances to the various secret projects at the Nevada test site. Lazar said that he and other S4 workers would fly to Groom Lake, then be bused to S4 in vehicles with blacked-out windows. The journey took perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, though it was hard to estimate distance when you couldn't see where you were going. The windows were deliberately obscured so that workers couldn't map the route or get a sense of exactly where S4 was located in relation to the main base. Security, he emphasized, was absolutely paramount. Every aspect of the operation was designed to ensure that no one could give away the location or nature of what was happening at SS4, even if they wanted to. Upon arrival at the facility, Lazar described passing through multiple security checkpoints. He would be searched, his credentials verified, and he would pass through what sounded like layers of security that ensured no one could bring anything in or out without authorization. The message was clear. This was the most secure location in the most secure facility in the world. The hangar bays themselves, Lazar said, were arranged in a row along the mountainside, each one numbered. He primarily worked in hangar number 4, hence his use of the designation S4 for the entire facility. Each hangar, he claimed, contained one of the 9 craft. The hangars were large enough to accommodate these disc-shaped vehicles, with room for personnel and equipment around them. Inside the hangars, Lazar described a clean, well-lit environment that looked like a cross between a typical aerospace manufacturing facility and something from a science fiction movie. There were workbenches, diagnostic equipment, computers, and tools. But there was also the craft itself, sitting there impossibly, a machine that by all known principles of physics and engineering shouldn't exist, but did. The sport model, the craft Lazar claimed to have worked on most extensively, sat in its hangar like a sculpture, its smooth metallic surface reflecting the lights above. He described it as having a diameter of about 52 feet and standing roughly 16 feet tall when sitting on its belly. The craft could apparently tilt so that maintenance personnel could access the bottom and the propulsion systems housed there. The exterior, Lazar said, looked like a metallic substance similar in appearance to brushed stainless steel, though it didn't feel quite like any terrestrial metal. He described touching it, and finding that while it looked solid and had the temperature you'd expect from metal, there was something subtly off about it, something that his brain registered as not quite right even though he couldn't articulate exactly what that wrongness was. The upper portion of the craft featured what appeared to be 3 circular areas that he initially thought might be windows or ports, but later learned were part of the navigation system. The craft had a seamless construction. There were no visible bolts, rivets, or welding seams like you would see on human-built aircraft. It was as if the entire vehicle had been formed from a single piece of material, though how that could be accomplished was beyond his understanding. Lazar described being able to enter the craft through a small hatch. Inside, the available space was limited. The center was dominated by the reactor and the associated equipment for the propulsion system. Around the perimeter were 3 small seats, clearly designed for occupants much smaller than adult human males. Lazar is not a large man, perhaps 5 feet 9 or so, and he said even he found the seats uncomfortably small. They seemed sized for beings perhaps 4 feet tall, with narrower builds than humans. The interior of the craft, he said, had organic quality to it, with smooth curves and no right angles. Everything seemed to flow together, as if the entire interior had been sculpted rather than assembled. The seats, the control panels, the structural elements all seemed to merge seamlessly into one another. There was very little in the way of obvious controls or interfaces, just some panels with what might have been touch-sensitive areas. The reactor itself, Lazar described as a hemisphere about the size of a basketball, sitting below the main deck level of the craft. This reactor, he claimed, was where the element 115 was housed and where the gravity amplification process began. He spoke of waveguides that channeled the amplified gravity waves to emitters on the underside of the craft, and of how the craft could apparently focus these gravity waves in different directions to control its movement. The technology, he emphasized, was far beyond anything in the human arsenal. It wasn't just a little more advanced, it was fundamentally different, based on an understanding of physics that we were only beginning to grasp. Trying to understand how it worked, he said, was like trying to explain calculus to someone who'd just learned to count. You might recognize some of the basic principles, but the application was so far beyond current human knowledge that mostly you just stood there feeling inadequate. Lazar claimed that the other hangars housed 8 additional craft, each apparently different from the others. He said he only got brief glimpses of these other vehicles, and didn't work on them directly, but they ranged from the relatively elegant sport model to what he described as more utilitarian-looking vessels. Some appeared to be in better condition than others, suggesting they might have arrived at different times or at different histories. The staff at S4, according to Lazar, was kept very small and highly compartmentalized. Each person knew only what they absolutely needed to know for their specific task. Lazar said he was part of a team working on understanding the propulsion system, but he had no idea who else was working on other aspects of the craft or what other projects might be underway at S4. This compartmentalization is a standard practice in classified programs, designed to limit how much damage any one person could do if they decided to talk or if they were compromised by a foreign intelligence service. He described meeting his supervisor, a man named Dennis, which is why Lazar initially used that name as his pseudonym in the May interview. Dennis, Lazar said, was apparently a senior figure in whatever program was studying these craft, but even he seemed to have limited knowledge about the larger picture. Everyone was on a need-to-know basis, and apparently very few people needed to know very much. The work schedule at S4 was irregular, according to Lazar. He wasn't there every day. Instead, he would be called when he was needed, would make the flight to Groom Lake and then the drive to S4, work for several hours or sometimes a full day, and then return home to Las Vegas. This irregular schedule was apparently another security measure, making it harder for anyone to establish patterns or routine surveillance. The location of S4, if it exists, has never been confirmed. The United States government has never acknowledged any facility at 51’s Lake. Satellite imagery of the area shows the dry lake bed and the surrounding mountains, but if there are camouflaged hangar doors built into the mountainside, they're doing their job because they're not visible in publicly available satellite photos. Aviation photographer and Area 51 expert Peter Merlin and others have conducted extensive searches of the area and have found no evidence of a facility at 51’s Lake. The area is within the restricted zone surrounding the Nevada test site, so getting close enough for ground-level verification is illegal and would result in arrest. The lack of any visual evidence of S4's existence is one of the strongest arguments skeptics use against Lazar's claims. However, supporters note that the entire point of such a facility would be absolute secrecy and perfect camouflage. If it were easy to spot S4, it wouldn't be much of a secret facility, would it? They also point out that the government has a history of maintaining secret facilities that were later acknowledged, and that the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, though that argument can only be pushed so far before it becomes unfalsifiable. What we're left with is Lazar's description of a facility that may or may not exist, in a location that can't be independently verified. Housing technology that no one has been able to examine is frustrating for those seeking concrete answers, whether they lean toward belief or skepticism. The S4 facility exists in that liminal space of possibility, neither proven nor disproven, a tantalizing mystery in the Nevada desert that may be exactly what Bob Lazar described, or maybe nothing more than empty mountains and desert air. The 9 craft and the sport model at the heart of Bob Lazar's claims are the vehicles themselves, the 9 dish-shaped craft that he said were housed at S4. Let's examine what he said about these remarkable machines, focusing particularly on the one he called the sport model, which he claimed to have studied most closely. The term flying saucer has been part of popular culture since 1947, when pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 unusual objects flying near Mount Rainier in Washington state. He described their movement as being like saucers skipping across water, and a newspaper report misinterpreted this to mean the objects themselves were saucer-shaped. The term stuck, even though Arnold had actually described crescent-shaped objects. Nevertheless, flying saucers became the archetypal image of alien spacecraft in the public imagination. Lazar's description of the craft at S4 fits this classic flying saucer profile. The sport model, he said, was disc-shaped, wider than it was tall, with a distinctive profile that looked unmistakably artificial. It wasn't just a simple disc, though. It had contours and details that suggested sophisticated engineering. The diameter, as mentioned, was approximately 52 feet and 9 inches, and the height when sitting on the ground was about 16 feet. These dimensions would make it smaller than many military aircraft, but still substantial. For comparison, an F-16 fighter jet has a wingspan of 32 feet and length of 49 feet. So the sport model was in that general size range, though its disc shape meant it presented a very different profile. The craft's exterior, according to Lazar, had that brushed stainless steel appearance, though he insisted the material was like nothing found on Earth. He described the surface as being smooth to the touch, but with a texture that was subtly wrong, as if your fingers were telling you this looked like metal, and felt mostly like metal, but something about it wasn't quite metal as your brain understood it. This is a fascinating detail because it suggests either Lazar had a very specific tactile experience with this alleged craft, or he was very good at creating sensory details to make his story more believable. The most distinctive features of the sport model's upper surface were three circular areas that Lazar initially thought might be windows, or viewports. They were arranged in a triangular pattern, each one, perhaps, 3 feet in diameter. The surfaces of these circular areas appeared darker than the rest of the craft, almost like dark glass or perhaps some kind of sensor array. Lazar later learned that these weren't windows, but were actually part of the craft's navigation system, though he was vague on the specific details of how they functioned. Around the perimeter of the disc was a raised rim or edge, giving the craft a classic flying saucer profile when viewed from the side. This rim wasn't just decorative, it apparently housed some of the craft's systems, though Lazar was not clear on precisely what. The underside of the craft was where things got really interesting from a propulsion standpoint. The sport model could tilt on its side for maintenance, and when it did, the bottom was revealed to house the 3 gravity amplifiers that Lazar described as being crucial to the propulsion system. These amplifiers were arranged in a triangular pattern, matching the arrangement of the navigation areas on top. Each amplifier could apparently be focused independently, allowing the craft to control the direction and intensity of the gravity field it generated. The craft's entrance hatch was small, just large enough for a normal-sized person to squeeze through with some difficulty. This supported Lazar's claim that the craft was designed for being smaller than adult humans. Once inside, you'd find yourself in a space that was cramped by human standards. The central column housed the reactor and the associated systems, with the 3 small seats arranged around the perimeter. These seats, Lazar emphasized, were clearly not designed for humans. They were too small, too narrow, and positioned at angles that would be uncomfortable for human anatomy. He estimated they would fit beings perhaps 3.5 to 4 feet tall, with slender builds and proportions different from humans. This detail, if accurate, suggests that the craft's designers didn't expect or intend for human-sized occupants, which would make sense if these were genuinely extraterrestrial vehicles. The control interfaces, such as they were, seemed almost non-existent by human standards. There were no obvious buttons, switches, levers, or displays that would look familiar to a pilot. Instead, there were smooth panels that might have been touch-sensitive or possibly interfaced with the pilot in some other way. Lazar speculated that the craft might be controlled through some form of direct neural interface, or perhaps even through thought, though he admitted this was pure speculation on his part, based on the absence of conventional controls. What about the other 8 craft? Lazar said he only got brief glimpses of these, usually when being escorted past their hangars, or during rare moments when multiple craft were being worked on simultaneously. He described them as varying considerably in size and design. Some were larger than the sport model, some smaller. Some had the same general dish shape, while others had different configurations. Some appeared to be in good condition, while others seemed damaged or only partially functional. One craft he mentioned, though he didn't elaborate extensively, appeared more angular than the sport model, with what might have been surface panels or segments that gave it a more mechanical appearance. Another, he said, seemed older or more worn, with discoloration on its surface that might have been damaged from atmospheric entry, or perhaps just age. These details suggest that if the craft exist, they didn't all arrive at the same time or from the same source. The variation among the 9 craft raises interesting questions. If the US government had recovered multiple extraterrestrial vehicles, did they come from different crashes over the years? Were they from different civilizations? Did some arrive as gifts or through some form of exchange, while others were salvaged from accidents? Lazar said he didn't know the answers to these questions, that such information was above his pay grade and outside his compartment of knowledge. What he did know, or claimed to know, was that these craft represented technology far beyond human capability. They didn't use rocket engines or jet engines or any form of propulsion that worked by expelling mass. They didn't have obvious fuel tanks, because they didn't burn fuel in any conventional sense. They didn't have large amounts of structural support, because they didn't need to withstand the stresses that conventional aircraft experience. In many ways, they were more like something that had been grown than something that had been built, organic in their design despite being machines. The construction methods were a complete mystery. The seamless nature of the craft suggested either incredibly advanced manufacturing techniques, or perhaps something like 3-dimensional printing, but at a molecular level, building the entire craft atom by atom to achieve those perfect seams and that uniform structure. The materials themselves were unknown. Even if you could physically examine the craft, even if you could cut off a sample and analyze it in a laboratory, you might not be able to replicate it, because the manufacturing process might be as important as the materials themselves. Lazar spoke about how humbling it was to stand next to these craft, to touch them, to realize that you were in the presence of technology that made humanity's greatest achievements look primitive by comparison. He compared it to showing a smartphone to Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci was a genius, but he simply lacked the foundational knowledge of electronics, computer science, material science, and hundreds of other fields that would be necessary to even begin to understand what he was looking at. The sport model, according to Lazar, demonstrated capabilities that seemed to violate the laws of physics as we understand them. It could hover silently, with no visible means of support. It could accelerate instantly to high speeds without any apparent thrust or reaction mass. It could make sharp turns that should have torn the craft apart, or killed any occupants through sheer gore forces. It didn't emit heat that would be associated with any known propulsion system. It didn't create sonic booms when breaking the sound barrier. It was, in short, everything that UFO witnesses have been reporting for decades. A craft that flew in ways that conventional aircraft simply cannot. If such craft exist, if they are real and not the product of Bob Lazar's imagination or a disinformation campaign, then they represent proof positive that humanity is not alone in the universe. They would indicate that at least one other intelligent species, possibly several, has developed technology far beyond ours, has figured out how to travel the vast distances between stars, and has at some point made contact with Earth, or at least visited our planet. The implications would be staggering, not just for science and technology, but for philosophy, religion, politics, and virtually every aspect of human civilization. And yet, despite Bob Lazar's detailed descriptions, despite his consistency in telling this story over more than 3 decades, no one outside of those who might work in such programs has ever been able to verify the existence of these craft. No photographs have emerged. No other alleged insiders have come forward to corroborate Lazar's specific claims. We're left with one man's testimony about machines that, if real, would change everything we know about our place in the universe. Element 115. The impossible fuel. Of all the details in Bob Lazar's account of working at S4, perhaps none is more fascinating or controversial than his claims about element 115, the mysterious fuel that he said powered the alien craft. Let's explore what he said about this element, what science has discovered since his claims, and what it all might mean. In 1989, when Lazar first went public with his claims, the periodic table of elements only extended up to about element 1. Elements are defined by the number of protons in their nucleus. Hydrogen, the lightest and simplest element, has 1 proton. Helium has 2. Carbon has 6. Iron has 26, and so on, up through increasingly heavy and complex elements. As you go higher in the periodic table, elements become increasingly unstable. Many of the heavier elements don't exist naturally on Earth and must be created in particle accelerators by smashing lighter atoms together. These artificially created elements often exist for only fractions of a second before decaying into lighter elements. The quest to create and study these super-heavy elements is driven partly by pure scientific curiosity and partly by the theoretical prediction that somewhere in the realm of heavy elements there might exist an island of stability, a region where certain combinations of protons and neutrons create elements that are more stable than their neighbors. Lazar claimed that element 115, which didn't exist on the periodic table in 1989, was the fuel source for the alien propulsion system. He described it as being used in the form of a disk, about the size of a hockey puck, that was placed in the reactor. When bombarded with protons from a small particle accelerator inside the craft, the element 115 would undergo a reaction that released tremendous amounts of energy, and crucially, amplified gravity waves. This gravity wave amplification is central to Lazar's description of how the propulsion system worked. According to him, the craft didn't push itself through space like a rocket. Instead, it warped space around itself, creating a gravitational gradient that the craft would fall into. By amplifying gravity in specific directions using the 3 gravity amplifiers on the underside of the craft, it could control the direction and intensity of this gravitational field, essentially pulling itself toward wherever it wanted to go. This concept isn't entirely science fiction. Einstein's general theory of relativity describes gravity not as a force but as the curvature of space-time. Massive objects like stars and planets bend space around themselves, and other objects follow the curves in that space, which we experience as gravitational attraction. If you could artificially create such curvature, you could theoretically manipulate gravity. The problem is that current human technology has no way to do this. The energies involved in warping space to any significant degree are astronomical, far beyond anything we can generate. Lazar claimed that element 115 made this possible because of its exotic properties. When properly stimulated, it could produce focused gravity waves of sufficient strength to warp space around the craft. These weren't gravity waves in the sense of gravitational radiation that modern gravitational wave detectors like LIGO look for. Those are ripples in space-time produced by catastrophically large events, like colliding black holes. What Lazar described was more like a focused, controllable gravity field, something that doesn't exist in known physics but would be incredibly useful if it did. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. In 2003, a team of scientists working at the Joint Institute for Nuclear Research in Dubna, Russia, successfully synthesized element 115 for the first time. They did this by bombarding atoms of americium, element 90 and 5, with ions of calcium, element 20. The resulting atom had 115 protons in its nucleus, making it element 115. The achievement was confirmed by scientists at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California and later by other research groups. Element 115 was officially recognized and added to the periodic table in 2013. It was given the name Moscovium, after the city of Moscow, near where it was first created. This discovery came 14 years after Bob Lazar first publicly claimed that element 115 was the fuel for alien spacecraft. To his supporters, this is compelling evidence that he was telling the truth. How could he have known about an element that hadn't been discovered yet, unless he had actually seen it being used at S4? However, skeptics are quick to point out some important facts that complicate this narrative. First, physicists had long predicted that element 115 should theoretically be possible. The periodic table isn't arbitrary, it follows predictable patterns based on atomic structure. Scientists knew that if they could smash enough protons together, they should eventually be able to create element 115. It wasn't a question of if, but when and how. Someone with knowledge of physics, like Lazar, could have simply made an educated guess that such an element would eventually be discovered. Second, and more importantly, the Moscovium that scientists have created is nothing like what Lazar described. Moscovium is extremely unstable. The longest-lived isotope has a half-life of less than a second. That means that if you create an atom of Moscovium, half of your sample will have decayed into lighter elements in less than 1 second. Within a few seconds, virtually all of it will be gone. You can't store it, you can't build a reactor around it, you certainly can't use it as a fuel for a spacecraft. The Moscovium created in laboratories would be useless for any practical application, let alone powering a gravity warping propulsion system. Lazar anticipated this objection. He has consistently maintained that the element 115 at S4 was a stable isotope. Isotopes are versions of an element with different numbers of neutrons. For example, carbon-12 and carbon-14 are both carbon, both having 6 protons, but carbon-12 has 6 neutrons, while carbon-14 has 8. Carbon-12 is stable and makes up most of the carbon in the world. Carbon-14 is radioactive and decays over time, which is why it's useful for carbon dating. According to Lazar, the element 115 at S4 had enough neutrons to fall within that theoretical island of stability, making it stable enough to be stored and used. This stable isotope, he claims, is what the aliens used and is completely different from the unstable isotopes that human scientists have been able to create. This explanation is convenient because it means his claims can't be disproven by pointing to the properties of Moscovium. He's essentially saying, yes, scientists discovered element 115, but they haven't found the right isotope yet. From a physics standpoint, there's a grain of plausibility here. The island of stability is a real theoretical concept. Physicists do believe that certain super-heavy elements with the right combination of protons and neutrons might be relatively stable, possibly lasting hours, days, or even longer. Some scientists think element 115 might have isotopes that fall within this island of stability. However, no such stable isotope has been discovered or created, and we don't know if it's actually possible. Lazar also claimed that element 115 was not synthesized artificially, but occurred naturally in the environment where it was obtained. He suggested that it might be created in the cores of certain types of stars, or during supernova explosions, where the extreme temperatures and pressures could forge these super-heavy elements. This is not entirely implausible. We know that many of Earth's heavy elements were created in supernova before our solar system formed. However, the idea that stable super-heavy elements like element 115 could survive long enough to be collected and used is speculative at best. The propulsion system Lazar described based on element 115 sounds like something from science fiction. And indeed, it has similarities to concepts like the Alcubierre warp drive, a theoretical propulsion system proposed by physicist Miguel Alcubierre in 1994. Alcubierre's concept involves compressing space in front of a spacecraft and expanding it behind, creating a warp bubble that carries the ship along faster than light, without the ship itself moving faster than light through space. The ship would essentially surf on a wave of distorted spacetime. The problem with the Alcubierre drive, and with any similar propulsion system based on warping space, is the enormous amount of energy required. Early calculations suggested you'd need more energy than exists in the entire observable universe. Later refinements of the concept reduced the energy requirements but still left them at levels far beyond what any current or foreseeable human technology could provide. If element 115 could somehow provide this energy, it would indeed be revolutionary, but there's no evidence that any element could do this. Another issue is that gravity wave amplification, as Lazar describes it, doesn't fit with current understanding of physics. Gravity waves do exist. They're ripples in spacetime that propagate at the speed of light, and we've detected them from cosmic events like merging black holes. But these waves are incredibly weak and are generated only by the most violent events in the universe. The idea of amplifying gravity waves with a small reactor to warp space around a spacecraft is not something that appears possible within known physics. Of course, Lazar supporters would argue that this is precisely the point. If the technology is alien, it might be based on